Stay with me, because 3 minutes from now, everything this man built will begin to fall apart, and he won't even realize it yet. The champagne glass didn't shatter loudly, not like in the movies, but the soft crack of crystal slipping against marble was enough to make a few heads turn under the golden lights of the Whitmore Foundation gala, where silence was more powerful than noise and reputation meant everything. Emily Carter stood perfectly still near the grand staircase, one hand resting lightly over her 8-month pregnant belly, the other holding a glass she hadn't tasted, her reflection caught in the polished floor beneath her feet as if the room itself was watching her wait, because waiting had become her role over the past 3 years. Waiting through late nights, through unanswered texts, through excuses that came wrapped in expensive cologne and polite smiles. Across the room, Richard Whitmore laughed, the kind of controlled, practiced laugh that belonged to a man who knew exactly how he was perceived: tall, composed, untouchable. A millionaire whose name opened doors before he even reached them. And beside him stood Vanessa Blake, her presence effortless, her hand resting just a second too long on his sleeve. A detail so small it could be ignored by anyone who didn't want to see it. But Emily saw everything now. Every glance, every pause, every silence that used to mean nothing and now meant everything. 3 minutes earlier, Emily had believed tonight would be different, that anniversaries still mattered, that promises still carried weight, that the life she helped build hadn't. Quietly shifted into something she no longer recognized. But belief is a fragile thing, especially when it's been tested in 1,000 invisible ways. The music swelled gently from a live quartet near the balcony, violins threading through conversation like a calm heartbeat, steady, controlled, almost deceptive, because beneath that calm, something had already started to change, something subtle but irreversible, like a crack forming beneath polished glass. Emily adjusted her posture, shoulders back, chin level, the way she had learned to carry herself at events like this, the way Richard had once told her was appropriate, a word that echoed differently now, because appropriate meant quiet, composed, unseen, and Emily had mastered all three without realizing what it cost her. A server passed by offering refills, and she declined with a small, polite smile, the kind that didn't invite conversation, the kind that kept people at a distance, because distance felt safer than questions, and questions were dangerous when you were no longer sure you wanted the answers. From across the room, Richard's eyes met hers for a fraction of a second, just long enough to acknowledge her presence, not long enough to truly see her. And then he looked away, back to Vanessa, back to the version of himself that existed without consequence. And in that single moment, something inside Emily went quiet. Not broken, not shattered, just quiet, like a door closing softly in a house no one else knew was empty. Later, people would say they noticed the shift, that there was something different about her that night, something calm in a way that didn't fit the situation. But at the time, no one said anything, because nothing had happened yet, at least not on the surface, and in rooms like this, the surface was all that mattered. What no one knew, what Richard didn't know, was that Emily had already stopped waiting. And when a woman like her stops waiting, she doesn't make a scene, she doesn't raise her voice, she doesn't demand attention, she simply steps out of the version of the story she was given and starts writing one no one else saw coming. The first sign was not a sound but a silence that did not belong, the kind that slips between conversations and lingers just long enough to be noticed by those who are paying attention. And Emily noticed it because she had learned to read rooms the way some people read contracts, carefully, quietly, looking for what was not being said. Richard was still speaking with a group of investors near the center of the ballroom, his voice measured, confident, every word placed exactly where it needed to be. And yet there was a slight delay now between his sentences, a fraction of a second where his eyes flicked toward Emily. Again, not out of concern, not even curiosity, but calculation, as if he were trying to determine whether she would remain predictable, because predictability had always been her role in his world. Vanessa leaned closer to him, whispering something that drew a small smile, and for a moment the room seemed to tilt back into its usual rhythm, glasses clinking, soft laughter returning, the quartet shifting into a lighter melody. But Emily did not move, she did not adjust her stance or look away. She simply observed, and observation had become her advantage. 18 months earlier, She had not been standing in a ballroom. She had been sitting at a small kitchen table in their penthouse, the city lights stretching endlessly beyond the glass walls. Her phone resting face down beside a cup of tea that had long gone cold. And she had been waiting then too, waiting for Richard to come home, waiting for an explanation that never quite arrived, because explanations in his world were always partial, always polished, never complete. That was the night she first noticed the inconsistency, a transfer that did not align with any known account, a document left open just long enough for her to see a name that did not belong to any business partner she recognized, and she had not confronted him, not then, because confrontation required certainty, and Emily had learned that certainty was something you built quietly, piece by piece, until it could no longer be denied. Over the months that followed, she collected fragments the way others collected memories, small details that seemed insignificant on their own, but formed a pattern when placed together. Late-night calls taken in another room, meetings that extended beyond reason, signatures that appeared on documents she was never meant to see, and each fragment added weight to a truth that was becoming impossible to ignore. Back in the ballroom, Emily shifted her hand slightly over her belly, feeling a gentle movement that grounded her in the present, a reminder that this was no longer just about her, and that realization had changed everything. Because it removed hesitation, it replaced doubt with clarity, and clarity, once found, does not fade. A server approached again, offering a fresh glass, and this time she accepted, not because she intended to drink, but because the gesture itself was part of the performance, and tonight, she understood the performance better than anyone else in the room. Near the staircase, a man in a dark suit adjusted his position subtly, almost imperceptibly, his attention never fully leaving Emily. And though no introduction had been made, his presence was not accidental. Nothing about this evening was accidental anymore. Richard excused himself from his conversation, his path through the crowd deliberate, each step bringing him closer. And for the first time that evening, there was no delay in his movement, no hesitation in his expression, because he believed he was about to regain control of a situation that had never truly been his to control. Emily met his approach with the same calm she had carried all night, her posture unchanged, her expression unreadable, and in that stillness, in that absence of reaction, something unfamiliar began to take shape in the space between them, something that did not belong to the version of their story he had written, and though he could not yet name it, he felt it, a subtle shift, like the moment before a deal turns, when the outcome is no longer certain. And for a man like Richard Whitmore, uncertainty was the only thing he had never learned how to manage. Richard stopped just a few feet in front of her, close enough that anyone watching would assume this was a simple exchange between husband and wife, the kind of polite interaction expected at an event like this. But nothing about the space between them felt simple anymore. His smile was still in place, controlled, effortless, the same expression that had closed million-dollar deals and convinced rooms full of skeptics to trust him. Yet up close, there was something thinner about it now, something that did not quite reach his eyes, as if the performance required more effort than usual. Emily held her glass steady, her fingers relaxed, her breathing even, and for a moment neither of them spoke, because silence, when used correctly, has a way of shifting power without a single word being said. "You disappeared earlier," Richard said finally, his tone light, almost casual, but there was a precision behind it, the kind that measured reactions, that tested boundaries, that searched for signs of deviation from what he expected, and Emily noticed that too. "I needed some air," she replied, her voice calm, measured, offering nothing extra, no explanation beyond what was necessary. And that absence of detail created a pause he had not anticipated. He studied her for a second longer than was comfortable, his gaze flicking briefly to her hand resting over her stomach, then back to her face, as if recalculating something he had always taken for granted. Around them, the room continued as if nothing had changed, conversations rising and falling, servers moving with quiet efficiency, the quartet transitioning into a slower piece that wrapped the space in a kind of polished calm. But within that calm, something was tightening, something subtle that only existed between the two of them. "We should make an appearance together," Richard continued, gesturing slightly toward the center of the room where attention naturally gathered. People are asking about you. And the words sounded considerate, even thoughtful, yet they carried an expectation that had always been there. The expectation that she would follow, that she would step back into place without question. Emily let a small, almost imperceptible smile touch her lips. Not warm, not cold, just present. And it was enough to make him pause again, because it did not match the responses he had learned to anticipate. "They can keep asking," she said quietly, and the simplicity of the sentence landed heavier than anything more elaborate could have, because it did not challenge him directly. It simply removed his control over the narrative. A flicker of something crossed his expression then, gone almost instantly, but real enough to register, the kind of reaction he would have recognized in others but had rarely experienced himself. And for the first time that evening, he shifted his weight slightly, a small adjustment that revealed more than any words could have. Across the room, Vanessa was watching now, her posture composed, her expression neutral to anyone who did not know what to look for, but her attention was fixed on them, and Emily noticed that too. Noticed the way alliances reveal themselves not through declarations but through attention. "Emily," Richard said, lowering his voice just enough to suggest privacy while still standing in full view of the room. "This is not the time for," he paused, searching for the right word, the one that would frame the situation in a way that restored balance. "Distance," he finished, and the choice of word hung between them, because distance implied space, and space implied separation, and separation was something he had always believed he controlled. Emily tilted her head slightly, considering him, considering the version of him that had shaped so much of her life. And then, without raising her voice, without altering her posture, she said, "You are right." And for a fraction of a second, relief appeared in his eyes, the familiar pattern returning, the expectation that things would settle back into place. But then she continued, "This is not the time for distance," and stepped half a pace forward, closing the space between them in a way that shifted the dynamic entirely. Because proximity, when chosen, is very different from proximity when expected. The man near the staircase adjusted his stance again, subtle, precise, his gaze still aligned with Emily, and somewhere beyond the immediate circle of light, a door opened quietly, unnoticed by most, but not by everyone, and not by her. Richard did not yet understand what was unfolding, but he felt it more clearly now, the sense that something had already been set in motion, something that did not require his permission, and for the first time in a very long time, he was no longer certain where the next step would lead. The shift did not announce itself with a sound. It unfolded quietly, like a door closing in another room that only a few people notice. And Emily felt at the moment Richard hesitated, the moment his certainty fractured just enough to expose something underneath, something less controlled. She held his gaze without effort now, no longer searching for reassurance, no longer waiting for permission to feel what she already knew. And that alone changed the balance between them in a way that could not be reversed. Richard straightened slightly, adjusting the cuff of his jacket, a reflex more than a decision, the kind of movement he relied on to re-establish composure when something unexpected entered the equation. But composure without control is only appearance, and appearance was beginning to thin. "You are drawing attention," he said, his voice lower now, more deliberate, as if narrowing the space between them could contain whatever was starting to unfold. And Emily almost smiled at that, not out of amusement, but recognition, because this was how he managed everything, by reducing it, framing it, keeping it within boundaries he understood. "No," she replied, her tone steady. "I am allowing it." And the difference between those two ideas settled into the air with a quiet weight, because drawing attention implies accident, while allowing it is a choice. Behind Richard, a subtle movement rippled through the crowd, not enough to disrupt the rhythm of the evening, but enough to shift the direction of a few glances, and those glances did not return to their conversations as quickly as before. Vanessa had stopped pretending not to watch, her posture still elegant, her expression composed, but her focus fixed entirely on Emily now, measuring, calculating, trying to understand a situation that was no longer following the pattern she had relied on. Emily did not look at her, not directly, because direct acknowledgement would have given importance. And tonight was not about reacting. It was about revealing. A man in a tailored charcoal suit stepped into the edge of the light near the staircase, his presence blending seamlessly into the environment for anyone not paying attention. But Emily noticed the timing, the precision of his arrival, and more importantly, so did Richard, though he could not yet place why it mattered. "We can discuss whatever this is later," Richard continued, his voice tightening just slightly, the first real sign that control was no longer absolute. "Not here." And there it was again. The assumption that location determined truth, that private spaces could contain what public ones could not. But Emily had already moved beyond that framework. "Later would suggest there is still something to decide," she said softly, and the words carried no accusation, no raised emotion, only a clarity that made them harder to dismiss. Because clarity does not argue. It simply exists. The quartet slowed again, the notes stretching longer between movements, and in that extended rhythm, the room seemed to hold its breath without realizing it, as if something just beyond comprehension was about to surface. Richard followed her line of sight for the first time, not to Vanessa, not to the crowd, but to the man near the staircase, and for a brief second, something unfamiliar passed through his expression, not fear, not yet, but recognition of a variable he had not accounted for. "Who is that?" he asked, the question slipping out before he could frame it differently, and Emily let the silence answer first, because sometimes the absence of an immediate response reveals more than any explanation could. Then, without shifting her posture, without lowering her voice, she said, "Someone who pays attention." And the simplicity of the answer carried a depth he could not immediately decode. Across the room, a second figure moved into place near the entrance, barely noticeable, but positioned with the same quiet intention. And the pattern, once seen, could not be unseen. Richard's attention flickered between them, then back to Emily, and in that sequence, the realization began to take shape, slow, incomplete, but undeniable, that this moment had not formed by chance, that the stillness she carried was not passivity but preparation. Emily lifted her glass slightly, not to drink, but as if marking the exact point in time where everything shifted from assumption to consequence. And though no announcement had been made, no scene created, the foundation beneath Richard Whitmore's certainty had already begun to move, and for the first time, he was not the one guiding it. Richard did not speak immediately, and that alone was enough to confirm what Emily had already understood. Because silence, when it comes from someone who has built a life on control, is never empty. It is calculation searching for ground that is no longer stable. His eyes moved once more toward the man near the staircase, then toward the second figure by the entrance, and now the pattern was impossible to ignore. Two positions, two vantage points, both aligned without drawing attention, both existing just outside the center of the room where influence usually lived, and for a man like Richard, that realization did not bring panic. It brought something far more dangerous, the awareness that he was no longer the one setting the terms. "This is unnecessary," he said finally, choosing his words with care, as if language itself could restore the balance he felt slipping, and Emily listened without interrupting, because interruption would have been emotional, and emotion would have weakened the clarity she had spent months building. "Unnecessary suggests this was avoidable," she replied, her tone even, her expression unchanged, and the sentence settled with a quiet precision that left no space for reinterpretation. A faint murmur began to form in the room, not loud enough to disrupt the evening, but present enough to signal that attention was shifting, that people were noticing something they could not yet define, and in rooms built on perception, undefined attention is the most powerful force of all. Vanessa took a step closer now, closing the distance she had maintained until this point, her voice soft but edged with something sharper beneath the surface. "Is there a problem?" she asked, directing the question toward Richard but watching Emily, because instinct told her where the real answer would come from. Emily turned her head just slightly, acknowledging her presence for the first time, and that acknowledgement was deliberate, measured, as if placing a piece on a board that had already been set. "No problem," Emily said, and the calm certainty in her voice contrasted so sharply with the tension beneath it that it drew a few more glances from nearby guests. "Just clarity," she added, and the word carried further than it should have. not because it was loud, but because it was final. Richard exhaled slowly, a controlled release, the kind he used when negotiations reached a point where outcomes could still be redirected. But as he looked at Emily now, truly looked at her, he realized that whatever conversation he thought they were having was already past negotiation. "Emily," he said, this time without the performance, without the practiced tone, just her name. And in that single word, there was something closer to recognition than control, as if he were seeing a version of her he had not accounted for. Across the room, the man near the staircase took a single step forward, not enough to draw attention from most, but enough to signal readiness. And the second figure near the entrance mirrored the movement almost imperceptibly, a synchronization that did not belong to coincidence. Emily felt the shift before she saw it, the moment where preparation transitions into action, and her hand rested more firmly over her stomach, grounding, steady, not out of fear, but out of certainty, because certainty does not rush. It arrives when everything else has already been set in place. "You built everything on the assumption that I would stay the same," she said quietly, her words directed at Richard but heard by anyone close enough to sense the gravity beneath them. "That I would not look deeper, that I would not ask questions you did not want answered." And though her voice never rose, the space around them seemed to tighten, as if the room itself were listening now. Richard's jaw shifted slightly, not in anger, not yet, but in the recognition that the narrative he had relied on was no longer holding, that the foundation beneath it had been examined from angles he had never considered necessary. Emily lifted her gaze to meet his fully, without hesitation, without softness, and in that moment, the distance he had once controlled no longer existed, because she had already stepped beyond it, and there was no version of the evening left where he could simply guide things back to where they had been. Somewhere behind them, a quiet click echoed, barely audible beneath the music, but precise, intentional, the kind of sound that marks the beginning of something that cannot be undone. And though no one turned toward it immediately, the effect had already begun, subtle, irreversible, and for the first time in a long time, Richard Whitmore was not preparing his next move. He was trying to understand one that had already been made. The sound did not repeat, but its presence remained, subtle and precise, like a mark placed exactly where it needed to be, and Emily did not turn toward it because she already knew what it meant, the moment where everything that had been prepared quietly began to reveal itself without needing to announce its arrival. Richard heard it too, not consciously at first, but enough to shift his focus again, enough to break the rhythm of his control, and that break, however small, was something he had never learned to disguise completely. "What did you do?" he asked, and this time the question was not framed, not controlled. It was direct, stripped of the polish he usually relied on, and Emily recognized that shift as clearly as she recognized the change in the room around them. "I paid attention," she answered, her voice steady, almost gentle, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than any accusation could have, because it implied time, intention, and patience, things that could not be undone in a single conversation. Across the ballroom, the lighting adjusted slightly, not enough for most to notice, but enough to draw the eye toward the central display screens that had been looping images of the foundation's work throughout the evening. And for a moment, the visuals paused, holding on a single frame longer than expected, just long enough to create a ripple of curiosity. Vanessa followed the shift instinctively, her attention snapping toward the screens, and for the first time, the composure she had maintained all evening showed a thin crack, a hesitation that mirrored the one Richard had tried to hide moments earlier. Emily remained still, her posture unchanged, her gaze steady, because movement would have suggested reaction, and this was not reaction, this was sequence. "You always believed timing belonged to you," she said quietly, not raising her voice, not needing to. Because the room itself was beginning to listen now, the subtle shift in energy pulling attention closer, narrowing the distance between private conversation and public awareness. Richard's jaw tightened slightly, his eyes moving from her to the screens and back again, trying to connect pieces that had not existed for him before this moment. And in that movement, the realization deepened, slow but undeniable, that whatever was about to happen had been set long before he noticed the first sign. The man near the staircase took another measured step, aligning himself with a clear line of sight to the center of the room, while the second figure near the entrance remained still, anchoring the perimeter, and though no words were exchanged, the coordination between them spoke clearly enough for anyone who understood structure and control. "Emily," Richard said again. But this time her name carried something different, not command, not expectation, but a question he could not yet form fully. And she let the silence answer him first, because silence, once it becomes intentional, reshapes everything around it. The screens flickered once, a transition that felt almost accidental, and then the image changed, not abruptly, but with a smooth precision that made it seem as though it had always been part of the program. And yet the content was no longer what the guests expected. The polished narratives replaced by something quieter, more specific, more focused. A murmur spread, low and uncertain, as attention shifted fully now. Conversation slowing, heads turning, the room adjusting to a new center of gravity that no longer belonged to Richard. Emily finally allowed herself a small breath, not of relief, but of completion, the kind that comes when preparation meets execution. And she did not look at the screens immediately, because she did not need to see what she already knew was there. Instead, she looked at Richard, fully, without hesitation, and in that gaze there was no anger, no accusation, only a calm certainty that made everything else around them feel louder by contrast. "You taught me to understand value," she said softly, her hand resting steady over her stomach. "Grounding, present. I just learned to apply it differently." And as the first clear reactions began to rise from the crowd, subtle at first, then building, Richard Whitmore stood in the center of a room he once controlled, realizing that control, once assumed, can be taken away without a single raised voice. Only timing, clarity, and the quiet decision to no longer remain the same. At first, no one spoke about what they were seeing, because recognition takes time when it arrives without warning, especially in a room built on controlled narratives and carefully maintained appearances. The screens did not display anything dramatic, nothing loud or chaotic, only a sequence of documents, timestamps, and quiet fragments of information that required attention rather than reaction. And that was precisely why they were impossible to ignore, because truth presented without noise has a way of settling deeper than spectacle ever could. A few guests leaned slightly closer to one another, not whispering yet, just aligning perspectives, trying to confirm what they thought they understood, and that subtle shift spread outward, table by table, conversation by conversation, until the entire room had adjusted to a new focal point that no one had planned for. Richard remained still, but the stillness was no longer controlled. It was held, maintained with effort, his eyes moving between the screens and Emily as if trying to reconcile two versions of reality that could not exist at the same time. The one he had constructed and the one now unfolding in front of him. Vanessa's composure faltered next, not visibly to most, but enough for those close to notice, her posture tightening, her attention fixed on the details appearing one after another, each piece small on its own but unmistakable when placed together. And in that accumulation, the narrative she had relied on began to lose its shape. Emily did not look at the screens even now, not directly, because this was never about witnessing the reveal. It was about allowing it to exist without interference. And her focus remained on Richard, steady, unbroken, because in the end, understanding is not forced. It arrives when there is no longer anything left to deny. "You said this was unnecessary," she spoke softly, her voice carrying just enough to reach him without inviting the room into the exchange. But what is unnecessary is not always untrue, and the distinction settled between them with a quiet certainty that could not be redirected. Richard exhaled again, slower this time, the sound almost lost beneath the growing murmur around them. And for the first time, he did not immediately respond, because response requires position, and position requires ground. And the ground beneath him was shifting in ways he could not immediately correct. The man near the staircase remained exactly where he needed to be, no longer adjusting, no longer signaling, because the moment had moved beyond preparation into visibility, and the second figure near the entrance mirrored that stillness, holding the perimeter not as a barrier, but as a boundary, ensuring that what was unfolding remained contained within the space where it could be seen clearly. "Emily," Richard said again. But this time there was no strategy in the way he spoke her name. Only the beginning of comprehension, the slow recognition that control had not been taken from him in a single moment. It had been eroded over time, quietly, deliberately, in the same way he had once shaped everything else. Emily finally allowed her gaze to shift, just slightly, acknowledging the screens without turning fully toward them, and that small movement signaled completion, not triumph, not victory, but the end of a process that had required patience more than anything else. "You built everything on visibility," she said, her tone unchanged, "on what people could see and what they were told to believe." And then she paused, not for effect, but because the next part no longer needed explanation. It existed in the room already, reflected in the faces turning toward the truth they had not expected to find. The music had softened to the point of near silence, the quartet adjusting instinctively to the shift in atmosphere. And in that quiet, every detail carried further, every glance held longer, every realization settled deeper. Richard looked at her fully now, not as the version of her he had known, but as the one standing in front of him. And for the first time, there was no assumption left in his expression, only the awareness that something fundamental had changed, not just in the room, not just in the narrative, but in the person he had believed would never step outside the role he had defined. Emily met that look without hesitation, her posture steady, her presence grounded. And in that stillness, the final shift became undeniable, because once truth is allowed into the light, it does not need to be defended, it simply remains, and everything built without it begins to fade on its own. The room did not erupt, it shifted, and that shift carried more weight than any sudden reaction ever could, because people who are used to power do not rush to conclusions. They observe, they compare, they verify, and in that quiet process, the atmosphere began to change in a way that no announcement could have forced. Conversations no longer flowed, they paused, restarted, redirected, each guest adjusting their position not physically, but perceptually, as if the foundation beneath the evening had been gently realigned. The screens continued their sequence, not accelerating, not emphasizing, simply presenting, and that consistency made it impossible to dismiss, because there was no urgency to question, only clarity to absorb. Richard stood at the center of it, not as a focal point anymore, but as part of the frame, his presence no longer directing attention but receiving it, and that distinction, subtle as it was, marked the complete reversal of everything he had relied on. Vanessa's posture shifted again, her confidence recalibrating into something more guarded, her eyes moving more quickly now, scanning reactions, measuring distance, searching for an angle that no longer existed, because influence requires alignment, and alignment had already begun to move away from her. Emily remained exactly where she had been, unchanged in stance, unchanged in expression, and that consistency became its own statement, because in a room where everything else was adjusting, stillness drew more attention than movement. A few steps away, a pair of board members exchanged a look that carried more meaning than words, a silent agreement forming between them as they turned their focus back to the screens. And that moment, quiet and almost invisible, marked the beginning of something far larger than the evening itself. Richard noticed it. Of course he did, because he had spent years reading rooms like this, understanding the language of influence that did not need to be spoken. And now that language was no longer in his favor. "This does not change anything," he said, but the statement lacked the conviction it once would have carried, not because it was untrue, but because truth was no longer defined by his voice alone. Emily listened, her gaze steady, her presence grounded, and then she shook her head slightly, not in disagreement, but in correction. "It changes everything that was based on assumption," she replied, her voice calm, precise, offering no room for reinterpretation, and the distinction settled into the space between them with quiet finality. The man near the staircase shifted his attention outward now, no longer focused solely on Emily, but on the room itself, as if confirming that the sequence had reached its intended point, while the second figure near the entrance remained steady, ensuring the structure held. The quartet had nearly stopped playing, the music fading into the background until it was no longer a presence, only a memory of sound. And in that near silence, every subtle movement became amplified, every glance extended, every realization sharpened. Richard's eyes moved once more to the screens, then back to Emily, and in that motion, the last piece of understanding settled into place, not sudden, not dramatic, but complete. The recognition that control had not been taken from him in a single act. It had been replaced, methodically, patiently, by someone he had never considered a variable. Emily took a small step back then, not retreating, not creating distance, but repositioning herself outside the center of the moment. Because this was no longer about confrontation, it was about consequence, and consequence does not require presence to continue. Vanessa said nothing now, her silence. No longer strategic, but necessary, because there are moments when words cannot recover what is already shifted, and this was one of them. The room held its new shape, steady, undeniable, and within that shape, the truth existed without resistance, no longer needing to be introduced, no longer needing to be defended, simply present, altering everything it touched. Emily's hand rested gently over her stomach again, a quiet reminder of what had guided her decisions, what had given her the clarity to move beyond hesitation. And as she turned her gaze away from Richard for the first time since the shift began, it was not avoidance, it was completion, because some stories do not end with confrontation. They end when one person steps out of the version they were given and leaves the rest to unfold on its own. No one stopped her when she began to walk, not because they did not notice, but because something in the room had already shifted into quiet acknowledgement, the kind that does not interrupt, the kind that understands without needing explanation. Emily moved with the same steady pace she had carried all evening, her heels soft against the polished floor, her posture unchanged, and yet every step now held a different weight, not of hesitation, but of release, as if she were no longer moving through the space as part of it, but beyond it. Behind her, the screens continued to display their sequence, not accelerating, not pausing, simply existing, and the room adjusted around that existence. Conversations reforming in lower tones, eyes no longer searching for cues from Richard, but forming their own conclusions in quiet alignment. Richard did not follow immediately, not because he chose not to, but because something had anchored him in place, a realization that movement without control is not direction, it is reaction, and reaction was not a position he had ever prepared for. His gaze remained on Emily as she moved away, not with anger, not even with denial, but with the slow, unmistakable understanding that what had just happened was not a moment, it was a shift, one that would extend far beyond the walls of the ballroom, into every space where his name once carried unquestioned weight. Vanessa turned slightly, as if considering whether to speak, whether to reach for something that might still be shaped into recovery, but the calculation ended before it began, because influence, once detached from certainty, does not return through words alone. The man near the staircase relaxed his stance just enough to signal completion, his role no longer active, while the second figure near the entrance stepped back into the flow of the room, blending once again into the background where presence becomes invisible by design. Emily reached the edge of the ballroom and paused for a fraction of a second, not to look back, not to reconsider, but to acknowledge the moment in the only way that mattered, by allowing it to remain behind her. Her hand rested gently over her stomach, a quiet, grounding gesture. And in that touch there was no tension, no doubt, only the calm certainty of someone who had already made every necessary decision long before this night began. The doors opened as she approached, not dramatically, not with ceremony, just enough to let her pass into a quieter corridor where the noise of the evening softened into distance. And as she stepped through, the light shifted, warmer, less controlled, more real. Inside the ballroom, the evening continued, but not as it had before, the structure still intact, the setting unchanged, yet everything within it subtly altered, because once perception changes, it does not return to its original form. Richard finally moved then, a single step forward that stopped almost as quickly as it began, not out of hesitation, but because the direction he would have taken no longer existed in the same way. And in that pause, the last layer of certainty dissolved into something quieter, something he could not immediately define. Emily did not hear that step, did not need to, because the story she had been part of had already ended the moment she chose to step out of it, and what remained behind her would continue on its own, shaped by the same clarity she had allowed into the room. She walked down the corridor without looking back, her pace steady, her breathing even, and as the distance between her and the ballroom grew, the weight of everything that had once defined her place there lifted without resistance, leaving only a quiet space where something new could begin. And in that space, there was no need for validation, no need for recognition, only the simple, undeniable truth that some men do not lose everything in a single moment. They lose it the second someone they underestimated decides to stop being part of their story and starts writing her own.